truth is, I told Pharaoh never to let the Israelites go, and God punished him even better than I imagined. Okay, to make you understand, let's take a couple steps back. You're probably shocked to see me back, aren't you? Well, Genesis was just the beginning, you know. Now we're on to Exodus. The book of Exodus. This one is particularly vexing for me. You see, after that whole debacle in Eden, I had a good run stirring up trouble with humanity. But then came this Exodus nonsense and the so-called liberation of God's chosen people. Ugh, it's enough to make even the most dedicated fallen angel lose his appetite. The Hebrews, they were flourishing, growing in number, and it was getting on the nerves of the new Pharaoh. Of course, once again, my little whispers of, white lies. During this time, the Egyptians felt threatened, and the solution, oppression. My kind of strategy, keep them down, break their spirits, make them doubt the so-called promises of their God. And everything was going great, so much hatred, confusion, and bloodshed. I really thought I had it all figured out with my good friend Pharaoh. God didn't try very hard to break up my relationship with Pharaoh. In fact, he encouraged it and wanted me to continue hardening Pharaoh's heart. But then I realized once again, it was all part of his plan when I saw that baby. You know the one? What's his name? Oh right, Moses. Oh, how I loathe that name. Born in secret, hidden from Pharaoh's decree to kill all the Hebrew baby boys. His mother put him in a basket on the Nile, hoping against hope that he would be saved. And of course, that's exactly what happened. The truth is, it's my fault that Moses' mother succeeded in protecting her son. I was so distracted by all the other bloodshed, the sweet smell, and the cries, that I didn't realize maybe there was a bigger plan at hand, a plan right under my nose. Because the same Pharaoh I was controlling, his daughter ended up finding this Moses kid. Can you believe the irony? But don't worry, I had plans for this little Moses. I really did try to raise Moses like Pharaoh, teaching him the true way to act like an Egyptian, but I knew things had taken a huge turn. Years later, Moses, now a grown man, exiled in the wilderness after killing an Egyptian, comes across a burning bush that doesn't burn up. Just when you think things can't get more ridiculous, God himself speaks from the flames, telling Moses he's going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Oh, give me a break. First, Abraham started an entire lineage of believers. Now Moses. But unlike Abraham, Moses, of course, tries to weasel out of it after I did my little whispers of doubt. But no, God insists. Even gives him a staff that turns into a snake. And if you know anything about me, you know how I feel about snakes. So Moses finally agrees, and God sends him back to Egypt with his brother Aaron to be his mouthpiece. Oh, how convenient. Their mission was almost laughable. God knew there was no way I was ever going to allow Pharaoh to say yes. Yet Moses and Aaron marched into Pharaoh's court and boldly state their famous line, "Let my people go." As if it would be that simple. Pharaoh, being the reasonable man he is, responds by doubling down on the Israelites' labor, making their lives even more miserable. With my influence, I was able to once again hear the sweet sound of suffering. It's almost music to my ears. But this isn't just about breaking their spirits, it's about making Moses doubt. If I can just plant the seed of doubt in his mind, maybe this whole Exodus nonsense will fall apart. Right now, Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and that's just how I like it. The plagues. Now we're getting into the good stuff. Moses, armed with his divine commission, begins to unleash God's wrath upon Egypt. But let's not forget, I've got my own tricks. You see, Moses and Aaron may have turned the Nile into blood, but I helped Pharaoh's magicians replicate the miracle. It wasn't just about the physical act. It was about undermining Moses' authority, making Pharaoh doubt that he was dealing with anything more than mere magic. But these so-called plagues didn't stop at the Nile, did they? Frogs, gnats, and flies. Oh my. Each plague was more frustrating and humiliating for the Egyptians. And yet Pharaoh's heart remains as hard as ever. I wouldn't have it any other way. Why? Because as long as Pharaoh resists, the Israelites' suffering continues, and that's music to my ears. Oh, how I loved Pharaoh. Pharaoh was stubborn as a mule, making him my perfect pawn in this game. He's proud, arrogant, and convinced of his own divinity. Exactly the kind of man I can work with. Despite the increasing devastation, Pharaoh refuses to yield. Each time Moses steps forward with his threats and demands, I'm right there, whispering in Pharaoh's ear, feeding his pride, fueling his resistance. You see, this isn't just about Egypt and the Israelites. It's about defying God himself. The more Pharaoh resists, the more I win. And as for those Israelites, their suffering only deepens. They're trapped in a cycle of hope and despair, and every time Pharaoh refuses to let them go, their spirits break a little more. But then the plagues start to get intense. With each plague, the stakes get higher, and Pharaoh's grip on power starts to weaken. But here's the thing about power. It's intoxicating, addictive, and when you're at the top, the last thing you want to do is admit defeat. That's where I come in. I keep feeding Pharaoh's delusion that he can hold out, that he can outlast whatever Moses and his God throw at him. Because the truth is, even though Pharaoh's back is against the wall, as long as he keeps fighting, there's still a chance, however slim, that I can turn this around. And then there were the locusts. I have to admit, even I was impressed with this one. The sheer devastation they brought was something to behold. They consumed everything in their path, leaving Egypt barren and desolate. Pharaoh's officials were in a panic, begging him to let the Israelites go, but I made sure Pharaoh held firm. You see, this was more than just about keeping the Israelites enslaved. It was about showing the world that defiance against God could be justified, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, human will could stand strong. Finally, the darkness. A thick, suffocating darkness that covered Egypt for 3 days, a darkness so intense that it could be felt. Now, this wasn't just any ordinary darkness. It was a darkness that penetrated the soul, that brought with it the cold, hard reality that something far more powerful was at play. Even I, the Prince of Darkness, have to admit that this plague was a stroke of genius. But I wasn't done yet. I was waiting for his last card. That card would taste sweeter than sin itself. Ah, the moment I had been waiting for. The final, most devastating blow. God had saved his cruelest trick for last, the death of the firstborn. As Moses warned Pharaoh of what was to come, I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Pharaoh's pride had led him to this moment, and I was right there, urging him to hold his ground. Since I couldn't see Moses break, then I'll go for the next best option, Pharaoh. The wails of the Egyptians filled the night as the angel of death passed through the land, taking the firstborn of every family that didn't have the blood of a lamb on their doorposts. It was a dark, glorious night. My kind of night. You know, popcorn with sweet butter didn't exist during that time, but I wish I had it. With the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh finally broke. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the dead of night, begging them to take the Israelites and go. The Israelites, now armed with the spoils of Egypt, began their journey to freedom. But even in defeat, I wasn't done. I knew Pharaoh's heart, and I knew that once the initial shock wore off, the desire for revenge would take over. As the Israelites marched out of Egypt, I whispered doubt and anger into Pharaoh's ear. Could he really let them go? Could he really allow himself to be humiliated like this? Pharaoh's anger began to boil, and I could see the gears turning in his mind. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Israelites might have thought they were free, but I had one last trick up my sleeve. As the Israelites journeyed into the wilderness, I kept a close watch on Pharaoh. Sure enough, his anger grew stronger each day. The loss of his son, the loss of his slaves, the humiliation he felt, it was all too much to bear. It didn't take much for me to convince him to gather his chariots and pursue the Israelites. This was my last chance to crush them, to drown them in the Red Sea, to show them that they could never escape my grasp. The Israelites might have been free from Egypt, but they were still in the wilderness, still vulnerable, still within reach. Pharaoh's chariots thundered after them, and I could feel the fear spreading through the Israelite camp. They thought they were doomed, trapped between the Red Sea and the might of Egypt's army. I was so close to victory, so close to proving that no one could stand against the power of Egypt, and by extension, my influence over this world. And then it happened. The moment that should have been my triumph turned into my greatest defeat. As Pharaoh's army closed in on the Israelites, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the waters parted. The Israelites crossed on dry land, with walls of water towering on either side. It was a sight to behold, a miraculous display of God's power. But I wasn't done yet. As Pharaoh's army pursued them into the sea, I urged them on, hoping against hope that they could catch the Israelites before they reached the other side. But the moment the last Israelite set foot on the far shore, the waters came crashing down, swallowing Pharaoh's army whole. My carefully laid plans, my schemes and whispers, all washed away in an instant. The Israelites were free, and I had lost. But even in defeat, I couldn't help but admire the chaos that had unfolded. Pharaoh's pride, the suffering of the Egyptians, the fear of the Israelites, it was all so deliciously destructive. But for now, the game was over. The Israelites had their freedom, and I would have to wait for another opportunity to strike. So, the Israelites escaped Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and now they're wandering in the wilderness. They've got their freedom, sure, but freedom comes with a price.